So yeah, I just want to welcome Dr. Kyle Schiefelbein-Guerrero. Did I get that right?
Close enough, yeah.
Close enough? Okay. And he's the Steck Miller Assistant Professor of Worship and Liturgy at United Lutheran Seminary. Um, we do have the way I kind of I don't know Kyle well, but we connected. If you weren't on the earlier part of this recording, I attended Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California, which is part of a larger consortium of schools called the Graduate Theological Union. And Kyle was teaching at the GTU, and one of our liturgy professors was out for the semester, and so the Evangelical Church, Lutheran Church in America, and the Episcopal Church have very close ties. Our ministers can officiate at each other's services. We're in full communion, and so Kyle was teaching liturgy that semester with some of my classmates, and I remember getting my ID badge to the library from Kyle. So it's funny how small, in some ways, the church is, but also how big it is. And so Kyle is zooming in from the West Coast, getting up early. So we really just appreciate him making the time to speak to us today about attending to context with digital worship.
Thank you, Father Daniel. One of the advantages of the daylight savings time change is that there's at least some light outside while I'm doing this. So I'm not fully in artificial light. Had this been a month or two ago, it would have still been dark outside. And so I would have looked really ghostly with a fake lamp. I'm already using a lamp, but it would have looked even worse. So thank you for having me come and talk. This has been a topic that has kind of fallen into my lap, I guess one might say, since the pandemic in the last couple of years. As Father Daniel mentioned, my work at Graduate Theological Union was a very unique hybrid position where I was faculty, but I wasn't necessarily teaching worship at GTU. I was teaching worship at some of the member schools. My main responsibility was overseeing digital learning, online learning, technology, those type of things. So a couple of years ago, I was discerning, how do I bring these topics together? My PhD is in worship. Allied field was systematic theology. But all of my full-time jobs I had up until I went to United Lutheran Seminary has been dealing with technology, because it's just a skill set I had, something I've worked on from various perspectives, and came across a group of people doing a new field called digital theology, which is expansion of the digital humanities, an expansion of kind of the religion and technology discussions that have happened at Texas A&M and in Colorado, at the University of Colorado, but really from a very theological perspective, and have been working with them and have become kind of the worship person in that, and saying, well, how does the digital and the liturgical come together? And because of circumstance, because I'd already been working on that, presented a paper at the American Academy of Religion last fall on that. Because of that topic and the circumstances of the pandemic, um, this, like I said, kind of fell into my lap as someone who has worked on this topic, worked on these questions, and now really them having to be very practical, because congregations are trying to figure this out. And for some congregations, it's the first time they've had to figure it out. I mean, it may be in the back of their mind, we should do something with live streaming, or, we should have some sort of Bible study where people can gather through Zoom, but it was never an immediate concern until March, until the pandemic hit, and realized that church needed to operate differently than it had in the past. And so that's where I have this, I'm titling this digital worship. Online worship is sometimes a phrase that's used, but I'm going to say digital worship for this regard. The particular I want to take with this presentation is looking at context. Because what's nice about the digital is that we're not as restricted to a particular building or particular geographic area as in some place, as normal. So the digital allows us to address context even more. So this may look familiar to many people who are accustomed to digital worship. You're sitting on this looks like a MacBook, and you're watching live stream someone doing a liturgy. And I notice every time I see this graphic, I know something new. This person only has 8% battery life left. So luckily they're at the Eucharist because this laptop will probably die relatively soon. So at least they'll get through the liturgy before the laptop dies. But before we kind of get into some of the practical concerns or some of the larger theological concerns, digital worship, those are, both digital and worship tend to be rather loaded words. So to take a look at what do these words mean, or how at least I'm going to define these words as I talk about it. So digital, for me, refers to some use of technology. So this is why in some instances it can be considered online worship, because online is technology. But there are congregations that are doing more with drive-in worship, where they're having to use radio as a way to broadcast into people's cars. I would say that's a form of digital worship. There's the difference between, live streaming and video conferencing and pre-recorded. Those are all forms of digital worship, and they have very different implications. So digital means some sort of incorporation with technology. When down the road we go back in person as our primary mode of liturgical gathering, there will still be some use of technology. I think there's a smaller group of people who think once we're back in person, we're going to discard all the stuff we've done over the last year. I don't think that either is possible nor advisable, because the churches have found a new way to proclaim the gospel in this regard. Why would we want to disregard that? One of the questions that comes up with the use of digital, and this is primarily when the discussion is about online, is this dichotomy between the real and the virtual. And somehow, when you're online, it's virtual, therefore it's not real. This is a lot of the discussion that happened maybe 5 or 6 years ago when people started studying online church groups or online worship. This was really the big discussion, was that yes, online is there, but it's not really real, because real requires flesh and embodiment. Well, as someone who spends maybe 6 hours a day on Zoom, it seems, depending on what day of the week, teaching or attending meetings, and for some awful reason, meetings have expanded since we've gone in the online environment, because evidently we want to meet more. I will tell you that there is parts of my flesh and body that certainly feels what it means to be sitting in front of a computer all day. I don't normally wear glasses. These are for reading. But when I'm at my computer, I have to have them on all the time because of the computer glare. So that's something that is infecting my body. The other thing, if we think about it from a theological perspective, if certain understandings of Christ's presence in the sacrament, whatever sort of transubstantiation, consubstantiation, whatever language you're going to use, real presence, presence in the community. That's kind of the whole spectrum from the theological traditions. There's an aspect of that that says the virtual is the real. Christ has ascended into heaven. Christ no longer walks on earth as he had once done 2,000 years ago, but yet Christ is truly here, really here. There's an aspect about that that is virtual and real at the same time. The other thing I want to note specifically is that the digital is in itself an environment. So the online environment or the digital environment. Just like church buildings have a particular architecture, and I have not yet been to St. Paul's, so I'm not sure what the architecture is. I'm looking forward to, once I get back to Philly, once we start teaching in person at ULS, I will come and visit. But churches certainly have particular architecture, and architecture can either be good or it can be bad. My dissertation advisor, that was his number 2 liturgical law, was architecture always wins. So if we think about that, we have to adapt our liturgical practices based on our church's architecture. Where is the altar? Where is the ambo? How are the pews structured? Where does the choir sit? All those type of things. And we have to adapt our practices based on that. That's the same as true when we get to the digital environment. We often have to adapt our practices because we're in a new space. Not a fake space or an unreal space, a new space. The fourth aspect of the digital that I think is especially important for churches is the ability for interconnectivity. Where in the past we had been restricted or limited to a particular time during a Sunday or on a feast day in a particular building that was accessible by a particular group of people from the neighborhood. What the digital environment allows is a new level of interconnectivity that we did not have. People can now join in from anywhere, from any time zone, from any geography. If it's recorded, they don't necessarily have to be there at that specific time on Sunday. They can join in at a later time. They can join in more than once. I mean, I don't know if people have ever thought about that. People may actually watch the liturgy more than one time. Because they catch something in it, where if we had just done it in person, it would be fleeting. But once it's recorded or once it's put online, it has an enduring quality to it. It allows the church to be bigger than those who just gather in the building on Sunday. Now, theologically, we've always said that. We've always said that the church is bigger than just the 4 walls of the building. But in practice, that's been very hard to actually do until now. With the increased use of the digital in churches, that has actually become a norm rather than just a desire. Worship. So what is worship? Well, you do it every Sunday, you should know. But sometimes you do it every Sunday, but you're not sure what it is, but you just know you do it. I like to talk about it in terms of 4 key words. And I get some of this actually from Ruth Myers, who taught at Church Divinity School of the Pacific. She was on my dissertation committee. That's who I taught for a year. And really to see them as the kind of 4 primary words that have often been used for worship over the years, one of which is worship, of course. But the first one being service. And this comes speaking from the Lutheran perspective. This has often been the primary understanding for Lutherans, because this was Luther's understanding. And this is service is encapsulated in the German word Gottesdienst, God's service or service of God, which that of is a dialogical Can it be service to God, service from God, service for God? The genitive is ambiguous there, as it is in Greek as well. And the answer is yes, it's all those things. So it's this conversation between God and the worshiper. It's a dialogue. And therefore, it's centered. It's centered on this relationship. So that's one aspect of worship. The second is encapsulated really with the word liturgy, and in its Greek form, liturgia, which is often translated as the work of the people, although that translation is not very accurate. Liturgias in the ancient Near East were about public service. So paying your taxes was a liturgia. Trash collection and sewage was liturgia. It was service on behalf of the whole. In this way, I would say worship is about mission. It's missional because it's more than just our small little group of people. It goes to the idea that worship has something to do with the whole. So in this case, worship is decentered because it goes beyond us. The third word, and it's the word I tend to use in a general sense, worship, comes from the Old English worthship. And if any of you watch costume dramas on the BBC, you recall that even people as early as, or as late as the early 20th century would refer to, my lordship, my worship. This is something about honor and something about status. So worship as a word specific is about praise and thanksgiving, giving honor where honor is due. The fourth aspect, and can be the hardest aspect in the digital environment, and the one that has had the greatest amount of debates, is sacraments. So sacraments as those external forms, I believe this is how it's in the prayer book, the external form of an internal grace, or external, that external internal, is that there is something going on. In liturgical theology, we call this efficacy. It somehow works. So there are efficacious means of grace. Whatever you think they do something. The sacraments do something. Baptism, Eucharist, and so on. So all these concepts of worship are at play in some form during the liturgy, during the Mass, or whatever you want to call the Sunday event. Is that there's a conversation between God and the worshiper. There's this outward push into mission. There's this giving thanks and praise to God, and something is actually happening. Our gathering for worship actually does something. Whether even in those instances where you're not using the actual sacraments, where you're not actually doing baptism and Eucharist, our worship still does something. Digital worship, we think, is a new phenomenon because we've been thinking about it, especially for the last 7 to 8 months. But the whole idea of using technology in service to the church and in service to the gospel is not a new phenomenon. In fact, the Reformation, out of which many of us are heirs to the Reformation, either on the European continent or on the British Isles, was the first time the church took advantage of the prevailing technology. And that technology at the time was the printing press. You're like, well, that's great. You print a bunch of books. Well, that is a way of conveying the gospel, of getting the church outside of its specific building and specific walls. By using the prevailing technology, the church actually transforms society. You have books. The books including the Bible. That was what Gutenberg first printed on his printing press, was the Bible. You have pamphlets, you have sermons, you have other liturgical documents, you have treatises onward. Well, you're going to print these. People are going to need to know how to use them. So the Reformation knew that not only are we going to use the printing press, but we have to teach people how to read. Reading had been restricted to the upper classes, to the educated. But if we want to take advantage of the technology, we have to tell people how to use the technology. We have to take responsibility for teaching people how to use the technology. And so the church also took responsibility for teaching people literacy. This idea of pamphlets, and I love this because the word is Flugschriften in German, which means literally flying writing. Flyers, that's how we get the word flyer, that little piece of paper you stick on the bulletin board, because it's flying writing, it's quick, it's immediate. It's sometimes well done, sometimes it's not well done. And it often involves a lot of art. If you look at any of these Flugschriften from the 16th century, they're primarily woodcuts. Because you're in that place where I'm teaching people to read, but they're not quite there yet, so I need to draw it. So to adapt the technology for the audience. These are all inherent in the Reformation and really at the foundation of our Reformation traditions. Lutheranism, Calvinism, Zwinglianism, Anglicanism are this whole centrality of technology. These movements would not have happened without it. So we already have a historical mandate to engage technology and worship together. Our theological foundations we have already in Scripture. The first one, and the phrase, the idea of ubiquity, that's can be a very Lutheran phrase, but it is present in all the Reformation traditions as well. That's something that Christ's presence is everywhere. This is what the ascension means. This is what the right hand of the Father means. Christ is everywhere. We know when 2 or 3 are gathered, I am there with you. Jesus tells us that. Whether or not it's localized in the sacrament or in other instances, that's where the theological traditions differ. But there's an agreement that Christ is present everywhere. If that's the case, cannot Christ be present in our cables and in our pixels and our digital environment? The second is really that whole discourse of from 1 Corinthians 12, where Paul tells us about the various body parts. If everyone were an eye, where would the sense of hearing be? If everyone were a foot, where would the sense of smell be? Well, if everyone's a foot, everyone would smell bad, I guess. I don't know. But Paul is telling us that people have various roles. And in that, I would argue that people access the gospel in various ways. If everyone accessed the gospel in one way, where would the other body parts be? So that the church being made up of these diversity of roles means that the church is also made up is a diversity of modalities. People access the gospel in various ways. The third is something that we're coming up to soon with Advent and Christmas, is, again, we'll be talking about the incarnation. I mean, we should be talking about the incarnation all the time, but it's really at Christmas that we spend most of our time, because that's what the origins of Christmas are about, is arguments in the early church. Christ's incarnation means that bodies and flesh are important, although certainly John's gospel and Paul take issues with that at times. The early theologians have issues with that, especially Augustine, because he succumbed to the flesh a little too much, so he didn't want anyone else to. But if bodies and flesh are important in the incarnation, what does that mean for the ecclesia? What does that mean for the church? Does Christ's incarnation necessarily mean the church must always be enfleshed? Or is the incarnation primarily a Christological issue and not an ecclesiological issue, a churchy issue? Some writing has been done on this, that to say that because Christ was incarnate necessarily means the church must be incarnate is problematic. Does it take away from Christ's own incarnation when we try to conflate the two? But even if we were to argue that Christ, because of the incarnation, the church must be incarnate, again, just because we're in the digital environment, it doesn't mean I'm not here as a physical being. I can't touch you, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're not physical beings either. The question about incarnation, when it comes up in these discussions, is often about being able to touch other people. If you boil it down, well, it's not real because we're not embodied. Well, you're sitting there, you're embodied. Well, I'm not embodied with other people. Well, the other people are embodied. I see them, they're bodies. So you realize that the main question becomes about touching. I can't touch them. Well, during coronavirus, you shouldn't be touching them. That's part of the problem. So I think that calls into question what we mean by embodiment. Do we actually mean embodiment, or do we mean physical interaction? Those are two different things. Online or digital church can happen in multiple ways. And Andy Sanders, who is in the UK and has done some stuff with the Church of England and the British Methodist Church, has come up with what he calls the spectrum of hybrid church. And hybrid church is, how does online or digital and in-person interact together? And so it's this whole spectrum. So because there's 8 pieces, it's on 2 slides. So bear with me here. Of course, the first is a church with no online presence. That's kind of like the far end of the spectrum. That's not hybrid really at all, because it's just one thing, one mode. You start getting into hybridity when you start bringing together the digital. The church with a website that's active on Facebook, church where worship is regularly live streamed. That tends to be where most of our churches were in that second one prior to the pandemic. And the third one was where they're getting to, got to maybe in June, thinking this was a temporary issue and not a long-term thing, as we've really experienced. This fourth is that really online is understood as a locale. Online is understood as a geography. So now, just like you have neighborhood evangelism teams or outreach teams, you also have an online outreach team. You start trying to figure out who these people are that are coming to the website, and who are these people who are coming to worship online. This fifth one is really kind of the center of the spectrum, and really the hybrid worship or hybrid church. Online and offline participants can and fully participate. So as we start thinking about resuming in-person worship or post-pandemic worship, how do we not lose those people who have joined us because we've been online, who have joined us because the geography no longer restricts them from coming in and participating? How can they fully participate with others online and with those who are gathering in person? I think that's the hard one. How do we have both communities come together? And then as we start getting to further on the spectrum, we start getting further to those places that are primarily online or digital church or digital worship, where almost all the church is online, delivered by a team. or the church is all online, delivered by a mix of people on site and online, and then a church that is completely online or digital church. Some places have gone from the previous slide to the completely online church because out of necessity, because of the pandemic. And now that after the pandemic will be, how do we get into that middle part of the spectrum? How can both those who are here and those who aren't here participate fully? So attending to context, that was the talk. That's the topic that I came up with, I guess, on this. Well, context is culture. Culture and context kind of go hand in hand. Well, what exactly is culture? Culture is something people argue about. We have wars about it, culture wars. I mean, I think the most recent presidential election has typified the culture war dilemma again in the United States. It's something everyone wants to talk about, but is very difficult to define. So Ruth Duck, in her book, Worship for the Whole People of God, gives this definition. Culture is the dynamic, changing pattern of language, symbols, rituals, attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors by which a group expresses and continues its distinctive ways of being in this world. So pretty much culture is everything, is what Duck is saying here. But two things are important, and they're both D words. Culture is dynamic, and culture is distinctive. So it's dynamic means it changes. It means it's always in the process of evolving and transforming and adapting. It's never static. Once it's static, with Duck's definition, once it's static, it really stops being culture. And it's distinctive. Even though we share cultures, plural, think about the specific parts of culture. There are things we share, there are things we don't share. So culture is distinctive. It says, this is who I am. We may share parts of that culture, but we may also have distinctive aspects of other layers of culture. This is why culture is complicated, and culture is really multivalent or multi-layered. The second thing is really these kind of the semiotic understanding of culture. Culture is the way people make sense of their lives. They make sense of their lives through their language, through their rituals, through their attitudes, through their beliefs and behaviors. How do we make sense out of this thing called life? We have these externals that help us create meaning. And that meaning can be transmitted from generation to generation. That meaning can help me understand who I am. And so that third thing there, that culture is transmitted through things like language, objects, rituals, institutions, art, from one generation to the next. So this is what culture is. How does culture relate to worship? And this is an oldie but a goodie. This is from 25 years ago now, or 24 years ago. This came out of the Lutheran World Federation's the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture. And this is drawing on Niebuhr's categories of Christ and culture, so the relationships sound somewhat familiar. And what the document said, and the reason it's the Nairobi Statement was because the Lutheran World Federation was meeting in Nairobi when they came up with this statement. So that's how they came up with the name. That there are 4 specific relationships at work with culture. That somehow worship is transcultural, meaning that it somehow has a level of sameness with everyone everywhere. So it has this place of being beyond culture. So if we think in terms of examples, some things about worship that are transcultural, the use of scripture, the fact that worship uses scripture in some way, that's transcultural. Now, how it interprets scripture, that's different. But that scripture has a place is transcultural. People gather, the act of gathering, whatever the gathering might mean, not how they gather, but the act of gathering could be considered transcultural. The second relationship is the count of the contextual. And this is often what we think of when we think of the intersection of worship and culture. How does worship attend to the current culture and draw upon the current culture? Back in the 80s, this was the whole move toward enculturation. How does worship or the church ingratiate itself into culture and draw upon the cultural symbols? Language is often this, various symbols, musical styles that can be part of the contextual. And at the same time, there's an aspect of worship that's the exact opposite of that, the countercultural. How does worship challenge the prevailing culture? How does worship say what's going on in culture is contrary to the gospel? And again, I think this past summer, not only are we dealing with the coronavirus, but dealing with politics. This is a place where the church has either struggled or is finding its voice. I think presiding Bishop Curry, this is one of his contributions to general Christian discussions in culture. This is the Jesus movement is about love, is that is contrary to some understandings of culture today. The fourth, which I think is what the digital environment actually helps us with the best, is the cross-cultural. The fact that we're no longer limited to a particular culture or to a particular geography or particular symbols because we're not local like in the past, we can now see how our worship makes sharing possible across cultures and the sharing among different cultures. This is what's at the heart of all of those hymnal supplements to Hymnal 1982. Wonder, Love, and Praise. What's the other one? Lift Every Voice. These are attempts at the cross-cultural. How can musical styles of other cultures pollinate church in many directions? So when we think about these four relationships, and this here, I'm trying on Ruth Myers here from her book, Missional Worship, Worshipful Mission, which I still use as a text in my class. She calls this the matrix, the worship matrix. So worship with the matrix. She sees there are specifically 8 places or 8 components, or I think she used the word dimensions, 8 dimensions of worship where this relationship between culture and worship occur. With the people, who's there, who's leading, who's not there, who are the people for whom we're praying. The space. Is it accessible? Well, how is it constructed? Time. This is often liturgical year. Objects. What are our vessels made of? What sort of ritual objects are we using? Actions. We've had to adapt some of our actions. Passing of the peace with the clasping of hands is no longer possible because of the pandemic. Texts. This goes beyond, is it right one or right two in the prayer book? Although that itself is an issue of culture because it's an issue of language in the vernacular. But what sort of words do we use? What sort of images do we draw on? Music. The various parts of the liturgical music, the canticles, the stuff in the hymnal, what instruments are being used. Is it a cappella, no instruments? And the last one, which is the most difficult, and the rubrics we tend to ignore in our worship resources, silence. And silence, I think, is even harder in digital worship because we're so accustomed to the internet or TV or whatever have you inundating us with noise. So when someone is silent, we assume something is broken, that they froze, and the internet connection didn't work, rather than thinking they're just being silent. So thinking through digital worship, which is something you've already been doing, but some other just kind of practical considerations and just questions that to ask. What differentiates worship from Bible study? I've been to a lot of online worship where it just seems like I was at a Bible study. Part of it was because most of these elements of the worship matrix were missing. There were no actions. There were no objects. There was no sense of space. There was no silence. The primary thing was text. So how do we avoid just thinking we're doing a weekly Bible study? How is it worship still? How do we go back to those definitions of worship? How will worshipers participate? If it's live streamed, it's much more difficult because it's one directional. If it's via Zoom like this, people can participate more easily. What role does music have in worship? Now, music, there are technical issues with using music in worship online, but it's not impossible. How will people sing? What instruments will be used? Do we draw on our regular church instruments? Do we have to use different instruments? How will worshipers pray together? So it's kind of the question of participation. But if our prayer is corporate prayer, together prayer, how does that togetherness happen in the digital environment? The biggest question, and I've written on this from a Lutheran perspective, what do we do with the sacraments? Do we refrain from sacraments? Do we restrict sacraments to only when we gather in person? Do we allow people to have their own elements at home and have a consecration online? Do we send out communion kits? All these questions come from various theological perspectives. What do we think the sacraments do? What makes the sacrament? Why we should receive the sacrament? Why might we refrain from the sacrament? All those types of questions. I know in the Episcopal Church, there's been debates about that. In fact, Ruth Myers has written about that. You can go on the CDSP website and take a look. When will worship occur? Well, when you're no longer restricted to time and place, there might be different things about when worship could occur. Do you do it at your regularly scheduled times because that's what people know? Do you do it at altar times? Do you have more worship? This is what I have found so fascinating in the last couple of months, is at least from some of my previous students from when I was at the Lutheran Seminary in Berkeley, the discovery, if you'll say, of daily prayer and doing it online. And just kind of like, yeah, I talked about this in class. I'm glad you finally figured it out 10 years later. But really, I've seen an increase in ritualized worship because of discovering morning prayer, evening prayer, and Compline. Although they've always been there, they just have never done it. More than just Marty Haugen's hold an evening prayer, at least that's popular for Lutherans. In terms of generations in the culture that those come, how many people in the congregation have access to internet and technology? So when you start pushing digital worship, and you may have found this yourself, although being in Chestnut Hill, I imagine most people have access to this. But I know in rural Pennsylvania, this is some of the conversations I've been having with the Lutheran bishops in like in Allegheny Synod or Southwest Pennsylvania, where there are still, or Lower Susquehanna, where there's still places where internet access is bad. And people, because they've not had internet access, it has not been an immediate concern, they've not had the technology. So moving to online has actually become a barrier for them, because they could drive to church and worship, but online church didn't work for them. So the question then becomes, is what is the church's role in bridging that digital divide? And there I go back to the 16th century. The church not only used the printing press for the proclamation of the gospel, it taught people how to read so that they could take advantage of what was coming out of the printing press. Does this become part of what the church is called to do now? To help people with this access. And access, I mean, to think about access more than just the elevators and ramps in the church building, which took a long time for the church to do that. But now access in terms of being able to access all modes of the church. And then other practical considerations, which you've already thought through because you're in your 7th month of doing this as well. How is the congregation handling both formation and information? How is it more than just a content dump to people, but actually you're forming Christian community? How often do you communicate? What kind of groups? So if we think about that spectrum of hybrid church, you have the offline and the online groups. Those are the big groups. But are there subgroups in there? And then what platforms are you using? Are you live streaming? Are you doing video conferencing? Are you doing pre-recorded? Are you doing a mix of all of those? Are you doing hybrid where you have in-person and you have online? That all those have various implications, and they allow you to answer these questions in different ways. So that's the presentation. The quick and dirty of digital worship. We have, 5 minutes? So are there any questions?
I have a question, Kyle. Thank you so much for explaining that in such depth. I think it gives us tools to begin analyzing how we're doing worship currently, and are we, especially thinking about all the different elements of worship and how, as we plan services or participate in services, where we may be strong and where we may need have a growing edge. But one of the things I noticed was we did our first digital diocesan convention, and the organist at my wife's church is blind. And there was a certain way in which doing everything digital made it harder for her to participate. Have you come across anything in your research with how kind of moving to a more digital platform, which is more sight heavy, can impact those who may be sight impaired, or other kind of barriers along those lines?
So anytime you move to the online, when it comes to accessibility, especially with those who have physical limitations, you have to really think it through. I have not seen much written yet about digital worship and that, so, but drawing on my previous work of online courses, there are things you have to put in place to allow for the material to be accessible to those who have physical limitations. And in this case, I'm thinking, for those who are sight impaired, at least in courses, you would have a screen reader where it would read the text out loud to you if it's something very text heavy. If it's something musical, that becomes more difficult because you have text and note. In terms of movies or in terms of video, you often can add a track to the material, which is a narration of what's going on rather than just dialogue or text. But all of this requires additional work, and it requires additional costs sometimes. And it's because in the digital environment, we're so sight and sound heavy in the engagement of the five senses that in our buildings, we can rely on the other senses to help create a community, create an experience. But in the online environment, we're really sight and sound. So it means that, again, this is part of that adapting. Where are the places where we have relied on other senses in worship that we can no longer rely on now? And how do we change, or how do we implement new technology? Someone who can feel the rhythm in their body when the organ plays. They can't see, but they're able to keep up with the music because they can, or they can feel the rhythm, they can hear it. Well, you can hear it, but you no longer feel it. So the embodiment aspect seems to go away a little bit because you've lost one aspect of the sensual experience. I don't know if we've come up with heptatic technology enough where we could have someone, you could sit on something and it would also give you the vibrations like you were at church listening to the organ. I imagine someone's working on that because someone's always working on something. But you're right. I think we have to be careful about privileging some of our senses as well. And if the environment forces us to privilege the certain senses, how do we adapt to where those other senses are missing? But that's a very interesting question. I'll have to take a look and see if people have been writing on that more.
I think one of the we're almost up at time, but one of the other things I've been thinking a lot about is kind of this spectrum of like the cost of discipleship and being inclusive, right? Which I think there's a give and take in there in general, and I've thought about with the balancing of privileges. In some ways, when we first went digital, I'm like, oh, this is going to make it more accessible. But when you have a digital service, there's not necessarily like homeless people who wander through like the physical in-person space. They don't have access to that. But on the other hand, because we can't sing in our buildings, you can mute yourself on Zoom, or if it's a one-way live streaming, you can sing at home and have more participation than you would if you went to an in-person service with restrictions because of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating how like you gain something, but you also lose something, like depending if you're kind of in one mode. It's
Right.
been interesting to discover.
And so that's where I think, once we get past the restrictions, hopefully in the future, maybe sometime next year, this is where it's important for us not to lose access we've gained by moving online. While now seeing, yes, we have lost something by online, but now coming back in person, we're able to reclaim that. And now being in that truly hybrid church allows both. You're right. I mean, my congregation in San Francisco. We have a very large homeless population in San Francisco. And we would have many people attend worship on Sundays. And we're pretty much members without really being members because they were there every Sunday. But I have no clue if they've been able to find a way to participate online. With the libraries closed, and where people could access computers and the internet who don't have them themselves. I mean, there's a whole bunch of services that have been restricted because of that. And I don't think, as a society that has become so tech reliant, which is good or bad depending on your perspective, that we've done a good job of attending to that, of attending to that access just in society in general, of access to the technology. But I mean, this was the debates that were happening in Berkeley 30 years ago around the increase of the internet and technology. I mean, this is, talking to some of my older colleagues from when I taught at GTU. They remember the democratization of technology debates that were happening 20, 30 years ago. And we need to have them again. I think the pandemic has told us we need to have those debates again, because we are having an issue. The broadband, the move toward having everyone have broadband, which had a growth 5-6 years ago, seems to have plateaued again. Is it a basic need? Has it become a basic need in terms of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Does technology now play a role in the lower parts of Maslow's hierarchy about sustaining sustenance, where we used to just put food and water and air? Is technology now there? Is that how part of the dynamics of culture changing? Has culture changed where we put technology in terms of our needs?
It's been fascinating too, just to think, because we're now at a hybrid place where we have people who are coming in person, very limited restrictions. And when we first made that move to start having some in person, there was kind of some people were like, yeah, we've got to do it. And other people were very more tentative, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing because I think the different gifts you talked about, the body of Christ being evident there. One, there was this maybe extreme gift of faith or risk or cost of discipleship. And then there was this other that was kind of this gift of faith in a different way of, wanting to have faith to hold out and be safe and protective, and to see kind of both of them. It's been interesting juggling them, and then how that impacts worship. So this was helpful in kind of giving some categories to talk, or language to talk about that, I think.
I know it's 11:05 for you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us, and we were so privileged to have you online, and hopefully we'll see you sometime in person or maybe online again. And
You never. I mean, I still could. The original plan to do liturgical look at Holy Week.
yes.
I mean, I'll be back in California still. I'll be still here in California for that, but I can certainly do that one online.
Okay, I'll let the committee know. I'll let the
Okay.
committee know. Well, thank you so much.
Okay, you're welcome. Take care.
You too.